They say the Titans are blessed, that the Omnicia breathes life into them, and they walk as gods in service to the Emperor. But I stood in the chamber where they are made. I watched what they wire into the machine before it can move, and I saw something no one is supposed to see. What if everything we worship is built on screaming? I was born in the shadow of gods. That is what they told us in the creches beneath Riser's Manufactoria, where the air tasted of ozone and sacred oil, where the hymns of the Mechanicus echoed through iron corridors wide enough to swallow entire habs. We were the Forge-born, the children of the Omnissiah's greatest work, and our purpose was written in the very bones of the world that birthed us. The forges never slept, the furnaces never cooled, and the Titans, those colossal war engines that strode across distant battlefields in the Emperor's name, were the apotheosis of all we believed. They were not mere machines, they were living temples, avatars of the machine, God's wrath given form in adamantium and fury. I believed this with every fiber of my being. I believed it the way a child believes in light, in warmth, in the benevolence of those who raise them. I believed because I had never been shown otherwise. My name is Athan Marek, and I was 17 standard years old when my faith began to die. The city of Primus Explorator stretched across Riser's northern hemisphere like a wound in the planet's crust, a vast industrial complex where the greatest war machines in the Imperium were conceived, assembled, and blessed. The sky above was perpetually stained orange and amber from the forge fires, clouds heavy with ash and metallic particulate that glittered in the dying light of our star. The streets were not streets but transit corridors, wide avenues designed for servitor haulers and cargo lifters, where human workers walked in the margins like pilgrims navigating the gutters of a cathedral. I had known no other home. My mother had been a data scribe in the Lex Mechanicus archives. My father had vanished into the forges when I was 6, conscripted for some sacred work whose nature was never explained to us. I accepted his loss the way children accept winter. It was the order of things. The Omnicia required sacrifice, and we who lived in his shadow understood this truth better than most. The creche where I was raised stood at the base of Manufactorum Delta, a tower of blackened steel and ferrocrete that rose so high its upper levels disappeared into the perpetual smog. We were 30 children in my cohort, all of us born within the same cycle year, all of us destined for service to the machine god in one capacity or another. Our days began before dawn with the Litany of Awakening, recited in unison while we dressed in our novice robes. We learned binary cant before we learned to write Gothic. We memorized the 16 universal laws before we could properly understand what half the words meant, and we were taught, always and forever, that the Mechanicus was holy, that our suffering was insignificant compared to the glory of the Omnissiah's works, and that doubt was the first symptom of the weakness inherent in unaugmented flesh. I excelled in my studies. I had a gift for pattern recognition, for seeing connections in data streams that others missed. My instructors noticed this early. By the time I was 12, I had been marked for advancement beyond the standard labor assignments. I would not spend my life assembling weapon components in the munitions forges or monitoring reactor feeds in the plasma chambers. Instead, I was trained as an observator, a role that combined administrative oversight with technical assessment. It was considered an honor. Observators witnessed the sacred works without having to perform the dangerous labor themselves. We were the eyes of the Mechanicus, documenting processes for the archives, ensuring compliance with ritual protocols, and reporting deviations to the tech priests who held true authority. The augmentations came gradually. First, the optical enhancements, installed when I was 13. The surgery took 6 hours, and I spent a week in the recovery ward while my brain learned to process the new visual data being fed through my optic nerves. When the bandages finally came off, the world was transformed. I could see electromagnetic fields as shimmering halos around power conduits. I could perceive data streams flowing through the air like ghostly rivers of light. I could focus on details hundreds of meters away with perfect clarity. It was intoxicating. It felt like gaining a sixth sense, like transcending the limitations of base humanity. The respiratory filters came next, grafted to my sinuses during a procedure that left me unable to speak properly for a month. The cogitator link was installed last, threaded directly into the base of my skull, a bundle of fiber optic cables and neural interface nodes that allowed me to commune with machine spirits and access data repositories simply by thinking the proper commands. Each augmentation brought pain, then adjustment, then a new understanding of what it meant to be part of the Mechanicus. I was becoming more than human. I was becoming holy, or so I believed. My first assignment as a junior observer came when I was 15. I was sent to monitor a component assembly line in one of the smaller manufactoria, tasked with documenting efficiency metrics and recording any ritual deviations. The work was tedious but straightforward. I stood on an observation platform for 10 hours each day, watching servitors and low-level tech adepts assemble armor plating for Lehman Russ battle tanks. The servitors moved with mechanical precision, their lobotomized brains following programmed routines without hesitation or fatigue. Some of them had been human once, though it was impossible to tell which ones. Their faces had been replaced with smooth metal plates. Their bodies had been stripped of unnecessary organs and refitted with industrial tools. They worked until they broke down, and then they were either repaired or recycled, and new servitors took their places. I documented everything. I noted the production rates, the failure percentages, the number of units that passed quality inspections. I recorded the prayers recited at the beginning and end of each shift, ensuring they matched the templates in the Lex Mechanicus archives. And I felt proud of my work, proud to be contributing to the Imperium's war machine, proud to be serving the Omnissiah in my small way. I never wondered where the servitors came from. The question did not occur to me until much later, and by then, I wished I had never asked. I was 16 when I first saw a Titan in person. The occasion was a ceremonial processional, held to mark the completion of the war engine Ferrum Rex after nearly 15 years of construction. The entire city was shut down for the event, all normal operations suspended so that the populace could witness the god machine's departure. I stood with my fellow novices on a platform overlooking the primary transit corridor, pressed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other onlookers, all of us straining for a glimpse of the Colossus. It came like an earthquake given form. The ground began to shake minutes before the Titan appeared, a low vibration that built steadily until it felt like my bones were resonating. Then came the sound, a rhythmic thunder that drowned out all other noise. And then, finally, the machine itself emerged from the manufactorum gates, towering over the buildings on either side, so vast that my mind struggled to process its scale. It was a Reaver-class Titan, smaller than the Warlords but still immense beyond comprehension. Its armor was the color of old bronze, inscribed with thousands of devotional texts in scripts so small they were barely visible to the naked eye. Weapon batteries jutted from its carapace like the spines of some ancient predator, and its head, that massive cockpit where the Princeps and Moderati controlled the machine's movements, was shaped like a snarling skull wreathed in brass. But what struck me most was the sound it made as it walked. Not the thunder of its footfalls, but a lower, deeper noise that I felt more than heard. A subsonic rumble that seemed to emanate from the Titan's very core, as if the machine itself were breathing, as if it were alive. The crowd around me erupted in cheers and hymns. Tech priests raised their arms in praise. Workers wept openly, overcome by the majesty of what they witnessed, and I stood there, transfixed, feeling something I could not name. It was not quite awe. It was not quite fear. It was something older and more primal, the instinctive recognition that I was in the presence of something so far beyond human scale that my mind could barely encompass it. The Titan passed, and the earth stopped shaking, and the crowd slowly dispersed. But I remained on that platform long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty corridor where the god machine had walked, trying to understand what I had felt. That night, I dreamed of the Titan for the first time. In the dream, I stood in its shadow, and when I looked up at its towering form, I saw faces pressed against the inside of its armor plating, their mouths open in silent screams. I woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, the images already fading but leaving behind a residue of unease that I could not shake. I told myself it was just a dream. that the majesty of the Titan had overwhelmed my senses and produced strange visions during sleep. I pushed the memory aside and returned to my duties, and within a week I had almost forgotten it entirely. Almost. The year between my 16th and 17th birthdays passed in the unremarkable rhythm of manufactorum life. I rotated through different observation assignments, documenting production metrics in munitions forges, plasma refineries, and vehicle assembly lines. I grew more proficient with my augmentations, learning to interface with machine spirits more smoothly, to process visual data more efficiently, to filter the constant background noise of the manufactoria into manageable streams of information. I earned commendations from my supervisors. I was told I had a promising future in the Divisio Administratum, that I might one day rise to the rank of Magos Logistician if I continued to demonstrate such diligence. I believed them. I had no reason not to. The Mechanicus was my life. It was all I had ever known. The rituals and prayers that others found oppressive or arcane were, to me, as natural as breathing. I understood the importance of proper maintenance protocols. I appreciated the elegance of a well-designed manufacturing process. I found beauty in the precise choreography of a functioning assembly line, where every component moved in perfect synchronization, where human and machine worked as one unified organism in service to the greater good. I saw no darkness in it. I saw only purpose. The summons arrived on the 143rd day of my 17th year, delivered not by courier but by direct neural transmission while I slept. The sensation was disorienting, like waking from a dream to find someone whispering directly into your thoughts. Report to Manufactorum Theta 7 Secundus at the 7th hour. Witness the birth of the unbroken vigil. The Omnissiah's blessing be upon you. I sat upright in my cot, blinking in the darkness of the novitiate dormitory. Around me, 20 other sleepers breathed in the rhythmic patterns of deep rest, undisturbed by the message that had been laser-focused into my consciousness alone. I accessed my internal chronometer through my cogitator link and saw that it was the 3rd hour of the morning. 4 hours until I needed to report. I lay back down, but sleep would not return. Instead, I found myself running through everything I knew about Warlord-class Titans, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to witness. Warlords were the backbone of the Titan legions, the most commonly deployed of the Emperor-class god engines. Each one stood nearly 33 meters tall and weighed thousands of tons. They were walking fortresses, capable of laying waste to entire armies, equipped with weapons that could level city blocks with single volleys. Construction of a warlord typically took between 8 and 12 years, depending on material availability and the complexity of its sacred machine spirit. They required crews of dozens, from the Princeps who commanded the Titan to the tech priests, who maintained its systems to the Moderati who controlled its weapons. They were, by every measure, the pinnacle of the Mechanicus art, and I was going to witness one being born. The thought filled me with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was not a routine observation assignment. This was something far more significant, a privilege granted only to those deemed worthy of seeing the Omnissiah's greatest works in their most vulnerable state. I did not understand why I had been chosen. My record was good, but not exceptional. I was competent, but there were other observators with more experience, more seniority. Yet the message had come to me, and the message had come from a priority channel that suggested involvement from very senior tech priests. I rose from my cot and began preparing. I performed my morning ablutions with extra care, purifying my body according to the ritual of cleansing, reciting the litany of lubrication as I oiled the few exposed augmetic components visible on my body. I dressed in my cleanest robes, checked and rechecked my data slate to ensure it was properly charged and configured for recording. And then I waited, watching the chronometer count down the minutes, feeling my pulse accelerate despite my best efforts to maintain calm. At the 6th hour, I left the dormitory and began the long journey to Theta 7 Secundus. The manufactoria were already awake, the day shift assembling for morning prayers, the night shift shambling toward their rest quarters with the exhausted gait of those who had labored for 12 hours straight. I passed through security checkpoints, each one manned by Skitarii rangers, whose augmetic eyes scanned me with inhuman thoroughness before allowing me passage. The deeper I descended into the complex, the older the architecture became. These were some of the original structures from Rise's founding, built millennia ago when the Forge world was first colonized. The walls here were darker, stained by centuries of industrial runoff and sacred oils. The air was thicker, harder to breathe even with my filters. Theta 7 Secundus was located at the very bottom of the Primus complex, carved into the bedrock of the planet itself. The final leg of my journey took me through a maglift that descended for nearly 10 minutes without stopping, plunging deeper and deeper until I felt the weight of the entire city pressing down from above. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into a corridor so hot that my robes were immediately soaked with sweat. The heat was not accidental. This deep, the geothermal energy of Rise's core became accessible, and the Mechanicus had long ago learned to harness it for the most energy-intensive manufacturing processes. The forges down here ran hotter than anywhere else on the planet. The metals worked here required temperatures that would incinerate a human instantly. Even with my augmentations, I could feel my body struggling to compensate, my respiratory filters working at maximum capacity, my optical enhancements adjusting constantly to deal with the shimmering distortions in the air. I followed the prescribed route through winding corridors and across suspended gantries that spanned chasms filled with flowing metal. I passed enormous furnaces tended by heat-resistant servitors whose flesh had been replaced with ceramic plating. I saw tech adepts working in sealed environmental suits, their bodies cooled by internal refrigeration systems that vented steam into the already oppressive atmosphere. And finally, I reached the observation platform overlooking the assembly cathedral of the Unbroken Vigil. Nothing could have prepared me for the scale of what I saw. The chamber was a hollowed-out section of Rise's crust, so vast that its far walls disappeared into haze and distance. The ceiling arched overhead like the dome of some impossible church, supported by flying buttresses the size of hive spires. And in the center, rising from a foundation platform that covered several square kilometers, was the Titan. Even incomplete, even with entire sections of its superstructure still exposed and unarmored, it was magnificent. Its legs were pillars of jointed adamantium, each one wide enough to drive a cargo hauler through. Its torso was a cathedral in itself, a multi-leveled structure housing reactor cores, ammunition magazines, coolant systems, and the 1,000 other components required to sustain a war engine, and at the top, partially obscured by scaffolding and crane assemblies, was the head, the command center, the seat of the Titan's consciousness. I gripped the railing of the observation platform and stared, my breath catching in my throat. I had seen hololithic images of Titans. I had seen the completed Ferrum Rex during its processional, but nothing compared to witnessing one in this state, raw and unfinished, all its internal mechanisms visible like the organs of a dissected animal. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a monument to humanity's defiance of physical limitation, a declaration that we could reshape reality itself through will and engineering. It was also utterly alien. Standing there, looking up at that immense machine, I felt a creeping sense of wrongness that I could not explain. The Titan did not feel like a construction. It felt like something ancient, something that had always existed, merely waiting for the Mechanicus to excavate it from the raw materials of the universe. The air around it seemed heavier, as if the machine's very presence bent space and time, and from somewhere deep within its structure, I thought I heard a sound, a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. I shook my head, dismissing the sensation as a trick of the acoustics. Titans did not have heartbeats. They were machines. Sacred machines, yes. Blessed by the Omnissiah, yes, but still machines. The sound was probably cooling systems, cycling, or hydraulic pressure equalizing, or any of a dozen other prosaic explanations. But the feeling did not go away. Tech Mugos Varen Kale found me standing at the railing, transfixed. His approach was silent except for the faint whir of servo motors and the clicking of mechadendrites retracting into his robed form. When he spoke, his vox-modulated voice made me jump despite myself. "Welcome, Novice Marek, your attendance has been requested by the fabricator locum himself. You are to observe and document the final integration phase. Consider this an honor. Few are granted such proximity to the Omnissiah's greatest works. I turned and bowed, pressing my fist to my chest in the sign of the cog. I am honored, Magos. I will serve faithfully. Kael was a senior member of the Divisio Militaris, one of the tech priests responsible for all military manufacturing on Ryza. His body had been so extensively modified that it was difficult to determine where the organic components ended and the mechanical ones began. His torso was a housing of polished steel from which multiple limbs extended, each one tipped with different tools and interfaces. His legs had been replaced with a hover platform that kept him suspended a few centimeters above the ground. His head was the only part of him that still retained obvious biological features, though even that had been augmented. One eye was human, brown and bloodshot from the harsh environment. The other was a complex optical array that glowed with a soft green light and rotated constantly in its socket, focusing and refocusing on different points of interest. He tilted his head, studying me with that unsettling dual gaze. Faithfulness is assumed. What we require is understanding. You will see things today that may challenge your preconceptions. Do not allow sentiment to cloud your function. Remember that all flesh is weak, and all weakness must be purged in service to the greater whole. The words were liturgical, part of the standard catechisms, but something in the way he said them carried weight. I nodded, unsure how else to respond. Magos Kael gestured with one mechadendrite, indicating I should follow, and began gliding along the observation platform toward a series of descending staircases. We walked for nearly 20 minutes, spiraling down through the scaffolding and support structures that surrounded the Titan like a mechanical forest. As we descended, I began to see the work crews in action. Teams of tech adepts moved along the Titan's surface, welding armor plates, installing sensor arrays, blessing each component with sacred oils and canticles. Servitors hauled materials up endless conveyor systems, their augmetic limbs straining under loads that would crush unmodified humans. And everywhere, supervising every action, were the tech priests in their ritual robes, ensuring that each step of the assembly followed the prescribed procedures exactly. But it was the sounds that began to unsettle me. The deeper we went, the more I became aware of noises that did not fit the normal pattern of construction. There were the expected sounds, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulic systems, the crackle of welding arcs. But beneath those, almost subliminal, were other noises, whispers that might have been vox static or might have been voices, rhythmic thumping that could have been machinery or could have been something else entirely. And once, just once, I thought I heard someone crying. I glanced at Magos Kael, but his expression was unreadable, and his pace never faltered. We reached the base of the Titan and passed through a massive airlock door that led into the interior of the left leg. The space inside was cavernous, crisscrossed with support beams and cable runs. We followed a maintenance corridor that wound upward through the leg structure, passing chambers that housed coolant pumps, hydraulic reservoirs, and the enormous servo bundles that would articulate the limb. Everything gleamed with fresh assembly, but there was also evidence of age. Some of the components had clearly been salvaged from other Titans, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of use, their casings marked with devotional inscriptions in scripts I did not recognize. The Mechanicus did not build Titans from scratch, I knew. Not anymore. The knowledge of how to forge certain components had been lost during the Age of Strife, and even the tech priests of Ryza, with all their accumulated wisdom, could only approximate the original designs. So they cannibalized. They scavenged parts from fallen Titans, from wrecks recovered from dead worlds, from machines that had failed and been decommissioned. They incorporated these ancient components into new constructions, grafting 10,000-year-old technology onto modern frameworks, creating chimeras of old and new that somehow functioned despite the impossibility of it all. It should not have worked. By every principle of engineering I had learned, mixing components from different eras, different design philosophies, different foundries should have resulted in catastrophic failure. But it did work. The Titans walked, they fought, they won battles. And the only explanation the Mechanicus offered was that the Omnissiah blessed the Union, that his divine will overcame the contradictions inherent in the machine's construction. I had always accepted this explanation without question. But now, walking through the interior of a Titan for the first time, seeing the patchwork nature of its assembly up close, I felt doubt creeping in. What if it was not blessing? What if it was something else? We climbed higher, passing through the knee joint and into the thigh, then up through the hip assembly and into the lower torso. The heat intensified with every level. My robes were plastered to my skin now, and even with my respiratory filters, each breath felt like inhaling flame. Magos Kale seemed unaffected. His hover platform glided smoothly up the inclined corridors, his mechadendrites occasionally reaching out to steady himself against the walls, but otherwise showing no sign of strain. Finally, we reached the integration chamber. It was located at the heart of the Titan's torso, directly beneath the command deck. The chamber was roughly spherical, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, its walls lined with cogitator banks and sensory interface nodes that pulsed with soft amber light. In the center, suspended in a web of cables and support struts, was the neural core. It looked like a massive brain. If a brain could be made of crystal and circuitry and things that had no name in any language I knew, it pulsed with an irregular rhythm, and with each pulse, the lights throughout the chamber flickered in sympathy. And around the core, locked in restraint frames that held them upright but immobile, were the psychers. I stopped walking. There were 6 of them. Their bodies were emaciated, skin stretched tight over visible ribs, limbs reduced to stick-thin appendages that trembled constantly. They were naked, and I could see the extensive surgical modifications that had been performed on each one. Data ports had been drilled into their skulls at regular intervals, creating neat rows of gleaming metal sockets from which cables now extended, snaking back toward the neural core. Their spines had been opened, vertebrae spread apart to allow direct interface with the nervous system, and more cables had been threaded into the exposed tissue. Some of them had additional ports in their chests, in their abdomens, in their limbs. Every major nerve cluster had been accessed and wired into the machine. But what horrified me most were their eyes. They were open, they were aware, and they were filled with a terror so profound that I could feel it emanating from them like heat. One of the men was mouthing words. His lips moved continuously, forming the same phrase over and over, though no sound emerged. I did not need to hear him to know what he was saying. Please, please, please. Magos Kale moved to a cogitator terminal and began interfacing with it, his mechadendrites plugging into the machine's ports with practiced ease. "These are the resonators," he said, his tone clinical and detached. "Sanctioned psychers, collected from the black ships and repurposed for the Omnissiah's work. Their minds are uniquely suited to interfacing with the semi-sentient machine spirits that guide the Titan's functions. Without them, the war engine would be a mere automaton, incapable of the intuition and adaptability required on the battlefield. They are the Titan's soul." I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and strained. "Do they suffer?" Kael turned his dual gaze on me. The human eye showed nothing. The augmetic one adjusted its focus, zooming in on my face as if reading my biometric responses. "Suffering is irrelevant. They are sanctioned. Their lives have already been forfeit to the Imperium. Here, they achieve a purpose greater than anything their flesh could accomplish alone. They become one with the God machine. They transcend. But they are alive," I said. "They are conscious. I can see it in their eyes. Consciousness is a temporary state. The integration process will subsume their individuality. Within hours of activation, their sense of self will fragment and merge with the Titan's machine spirit. What remains will be less than human, but more than machine. Perfect union. Perfect service." He said it as if describing a routine maintenance procedure. He genuinely saw no moral dimension to what was being done. To him, these 6 human beings were simply components, raw materials to be processed and installed. The fact that they were aware, that they were terrified, that they were experiencing unimaginable violation was of no consequence. They were sanctioned psychers. They had no rights. They had no value except what use could be extracted from them. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand that this was wrong, that no purpose justified this level of cruelty. But the words died in my throat. I was a novice. Magos Kael was my superior by several orders of magnitude. Questioning him would be questioning the Mechanicus itself, questioning the Omnissiah's wisdom, questioning everything I had ever been taught. So I said nothing. I stood there, mute and complicit, while Kael continued his preparations for the integration. He gestured toward one of the seated terminals. You will document the process from that station. Record all biometric data, all neural integration metrics, all fluctuations in the machine spirit's coherence indices. This data will be added to the Lex Mechanicus archives for future reference. I moved to the terminal on legs that felt numb and distant. I sat down, interfaced my cogitator link with the station, and watched as streams of data began flowing across my vision. Heart rates, brainwave patterns, synaptic firing sequences, all of it rendered as cold, clinical numbers that completely divorced the information from the human suffering it represented. The first psycher's heart rate was elevated to dangerous levels, 200 beats per minute. His body was in shock, flooding with adrenaline and cortisol, fighting the restraints with every ounce of strength despite knowing it was futile. His brainwave patterns showed theta and delta dominance, indicating extreme stress and possible dissociative states. He was retreating into himself, trying to escape into unconsciousness. But something was preventing it. Something was keeping him aware. The neural ports. They were not just interfaces, they were stimulants, direct electrical stimulation to the brain's alertness centers, ensuring the psychers could not pass out, could not shut down, could not find any refuge from what was being done to them. They were being kept conscious deliberately. I looked away from the data feeds and back at the psychers themselves. The woman closest to me had begun to shake more violently. Her lips had split from dryness, blood running down her chin. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching desperately for any sign of hope, any indication that someone would intervene. When her gaze landed on me, I felt something inside my chest constrict. She was pleading with me. Silently, wordlessly, she was begging me to help her. I looked down at my terminal. I focused on the data. I did my duty. Magos Kael moved between the restraint frames, checking connections, adjusting calibrations, performing the technical tasks required to prepare for integration. He hummed while he worked, a binaric cant that my cogitator link translated as a hymn of thanksgiving to the Omnissiah. He was happy. This was his life's work, the culmination of years of study and devotion. He was about to breathe life into a god, and he felt only joy. I felt only horror. The other personnel began arriving shortly after. Tech adepts in lesser robes, each one assigned specific monitoring duties. Combat servitors, their massive frames barely fitting through the chamber's entrance, taking up positions around the perimeter. And finally, the fabricator locum himself, accompanied by an entourage of senior magi whose combined augmentations represented more metal than flesh. The fabricator locum was ancient beyond measure. His original body had been replaced entirely, preserved only as a brain suspended in a crystalline housing mounted on a chassis that resembled a walking throne. Mechadendrites extended from every surface of his form, writhing and coiling like serpents. His vox speakers were mounted on articulated arms that positioned themselves near whomever he addressed, and when he spoke, his voice emerged from a dozen sources at once, creating an echoing, layered effect that was deeply unsettling. "Blessed be the Omnissiah," he intoned, and every tech priest in the chamber responded in unison. "Blessed be the union of flesh and iron. Blessed be the war engines that carry his wrath to the impure and the heretical. Today, we consecrate the unbroken vigil. Today, we grant it life." The response was thunderous. "Blessed be the Omnissiah. Blessed be the machine god. Blessed be the holy work." I mouthed the words but made no sound. I could not bring myself to participate. Not when I knew what was about to happen. The fabricator locum glided toward the neural core, his hover throne moving with surprising grace despite its bulk. He extended several mechadendrites toward the crystal structure, interfacing directly with it, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the neural core flared with sudden brilliance, and I heard something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Laughter, not human laughter. Not quite. It was too layered, too distorted, as if 1,000 voices were laughing simultaneously at slightly different pitches. It came from the neural core itself, emerging from the crystal matrix, as if the machine spirit within had just awakened and found something deeply, terribly amusing. The fabricator locum tilted his throne backward, satisfied. The machine spirit stirs. It recognizes the preparations. It hungers for completion. Begin the anointment. Magos Kale and his team moved with sudden urgency. They approached the restraint frames carrying neural interface cables, each one tipped with a barbed plug designed to puncture directly into neural tissue. The cables were thick as a human arm, armored in segmented plating, and they writhed slightly, as if possessed of their own volition. I realized with dawning horror that they were not entirely mechanical. There was something organic threaded through them, something that moved and pulsed with a rhythm that suggested life. The first plug was driven into the skull of the man who had been mouthing pleas. The sound it made was wet and crunching, bone giving way under mechanical force. Blood sprayed from the wound, running down his face in dark rivulets. His body convulsed. His back arched against the restraints. His mouth opened in a scream that had no voice, that was only air and anguish. The second psyker was next. A woman, younger than the first, her eyes so wide with terror that I could see white all around the irises. The plug went into her temple, driving through bone and into the soft tissue beneath. She thrashed so violently that one of her arms broke against the restraint, the snap of bone audible even over the sounds of the machinery. But they did not stop. They never even paused. They simply continued to the next psyker and the next, working their way around the circle with the efficiency of a well-practiced ritual. I watched the data feeds. I saw the moment each psyker's neural patterns spiked and then began to fragment. Their brainwaves, which had been elevated but coherent, suddenly exploded into chaos. Synaptic firing increased by orders of magnitude, and then, slowly, the patterns began to synchronize, not with each other, but with something else. With the neural core, the machine spirit was reaching into their minds, taking what it needed, reshaping their consciousness to fit its requirements. One of the men seized so hard that his spine fractured. I heard the vertebrae crack, saw the corresponding spike in his pain receptors, saw his body go limp from the waist down as paralysis set in. The tech adepts noted it, adjusted the restraints to support his now useless legs, and continued working. The woman who had looked at me was next. Her eyes found mine again as they approached with her cable. She mouthed a single word. Why? I had no answer. I could only watch as they drove the plug into her skull and stole everything she was. The process took hours. Each psyker had to be integrated in sequence, their neural patterns carefully balanced against the others to create a stable collective consciousness. Too much individuality and the machine spirit would fracture, becoming schizophrenic and unreliable. Too little and it would lack the intuition needed for combat. The tech priests monitored dozens of metrics simultaneously, adjusting voltages, recalibrating feedback loops, ensuring that the torture occurred at precisely the correct intensity. Halfway through, one of the psykers died. His heart simply stopped, overwhelmed by the trauma and the shock. Alarms sounded. Tech adepts rushed to the restraint frame, injecting him with stimulants, shocking his chest with electrical paddles. They brought him back, forcing his heart to beat again, forcing his brain to continue functioning, because the integration was not complete, because he was needed, because his suffering was not yet sufficient to satisfy the machine's hunger. I vomited. I leaned away from my terminal and retched onto the floor, my body rejecting what my mind was being forced to witness. No one noticed, or if they did not care. I wiped my mouth, returned to my station, and continued documenting. because that was my function, because I had been ordered to observe and record, because to do otherwise would be to question the Omnissiah's will. The neural core grew brighter as more psychers were integrated. The crystal matrix pulsed faster, its rhythm accelerating until it matched the elevated heart rates of the dying humans wired into it, and from deep within its structure, I heard voices, fragmented, overlapping, speaking in languages I did not understand, and a few that I did. They were the psychers. Their consciousnesses had not been destroyed, they had been absorbed. They were still in there, still aware, still experiencing every sensation. But now they were not alone. Now they shared their minds with something vast and alien and utterly without mercy. The machine spirit had awakened fully, and it was feeding. The final integration was completed as the chronometer marked the 13th hour. The last psyker, an older man whose hair had gone white from stress, was wired into the neural core with the same brutal efficiency as the others. His screams, like all the others, were silent, but I could see them in the data. I could see his agony rendered as biometric spikes, as neural patterns fragmenting and reforming, as a human being ceasing to exist as an individual and becoming instead a component of something larger and more terrible. The fabricator locum raised his mechadendrites in triumph. It is done. The unbroken vigil has been granted its soul. Now comes the awakening. The tech priests began chanting. The words were in High Gothic and Binaric, layered together into a complex hymn that resonated through the chamber. I recognized some of the phrases. They were from the Canticle of the Omnissiah, verses that spoke of the union of flesh and iron, of the transcendence of human limitation, of the glory of the machine God made manifest. I had recited these same words 1,000 times in morning prayers, never understanding what they truly meant. Now I knew. They were incantations to justify atrocity. They were prayers that sanctified torture. They were devotions that transformed murder into sacrament. The neural core flared one final time, and then something shifted. The air in the chamber grew colder despite the heat. The lights dimmed, and I felt it. A presence, vast and hostile, pressing against the edges of my consciousness like a predator testing the boundaries of a cage. It was not malevolent, exactly. It was beyond such simple categorizations. It was alien, it was other, and it was awake. The Titan's machine spirit had achieved full consciousness. From somewhere far above, transmitted through the Titan's structure and into the integration chamber, came a sound that made every human in the room freeze. It was a growl, low, subsonic, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It reverberated through the metal, through the stone, through our very bodies, and it carried within it all the rage and pain and hatred of 6 human beings trapped forever in a prison of adamantium and fury. The unbroken vigil was alive, and it was screaming. The fabricator locum did not seem disturbed. If anything, he seemed pleased. Magnificent. The machine spirit is strong. Its wrath will serve the Omnissiah well. He turned his throne toward the assembled tech priests. Begin the activation sequence. We will test its motor functions within the hour. The chanting intensified. Tech adepts rushed to their stations, initiating systems throughout the Titan's frame. I watched my data feeds explode with activity as power flowed into the war engine's primary circuits. Reactor cores came online, flooding the machine with energy. Weapon systems initialized, running diagnostic checks. Sensory arrays activated, giving the Titan its first glimpses of the world beyond its metal skin. And with each new system brought online, I felt the presence grow stronger. The machine spirit was orienting itself, learning the limits of its new body, testing the connections between thought and action. It was not gentle about this. The Titan's limbs twitched and jerked as the spirit experimented with motor control. Somewhere in the structure, something tore loose with a screech of shearing metal. Alarms sounded, then were silenced as tech priests rushed to make repairs. Magos Kale stood beside me, observing the data feeds with his characteristic detachment. You see now, novice Marek, this is the moment of birth. The machine spirit struggles against its constraints, learning to control the vast power now at its disposal. Soon it will settle. Soon it will accept its purpose. And then it will be glorious. I turned to look at him, this being who had once been human but was now more machine than man. I see something, Magos. I am not certain it is glory. He tilted his head, his augmetic eye focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. Explain. I gestured toward the neural core, where the 6 psychers hung motionless in their restraints, their bodies still alive but their minds subsumed into the Titan's consciousness. They suffer, even now, integrated and absorbed. I can see it in the data. Their pain receptors are still firing. Their stress hormones are still elevated. They are aware. They are experiencing this. All of it. And? Kale's tone suggested he genuinely did not understand my objection. And we have done this to them. We have taken 6 human beings and destroyed them. Not physically, but in every way that matters. We have stolen their identities, their autonomy, their very capacity for independent thought, and we call it holy. We call it service. But what if it is just murder? The words were out before I could stop them. The moment I finished speaking, I knew I had made a catastrophic mistake. You did not question the Mechanicus. You did not suggest that the Omnissiah's works were anything less than perfect. You did not imply that the sacred rituals were simply barbarism dressed in devotional language. Magos Kael went very still. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its previous warmth. His tone was now purely mechanical, stripped of any pretense of humanity. Novice Marek, you will report to the Hall of Concordance immediately following this observation period. Your comments have been logged. They will be reviewed by Senior Magi. You are dismissed from this station. He gestured to one of the combat servitors, which immediately moved to my side. Its dead eyes stared at nothing. Its augmetic hands, each one capable of crushing my skull like an egg, hovered near my shoulders. The message was clear. I was no longer trusted to observe freely. I was now being watched. I rose from my terminal and followed the servitor toward the chamber's exit. As I passed the restraint frames, I made the mistake of looking at the psychers one last time. Their bodies were completely still now. All voluntary movement ceased, but their eyes continued to track, to dart back and forth, to demonstrate that somewhere inside those meat prisons, consciousness remained. One of them, the woman who had looked at me earlier, managed to turn her head slightly. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I saw something that would never leave me. Not forgiveness, not even hatred, just a simple, desperate plea. Remember me. Remember that I was human. Remember that I existed before this. I nodded, once, and continued walking. The journey back to the surface felt like ascending from the underworld. With each level I climbed, the temperature dropped slightly. The air became fractionally easier to breathe, but the weight on my conscience grew heavier. I had witnessed something that should never be seen. I had been shown the machinery behind the divine, and it was not gears and blessings. It was suffering. It was calculated cruelty on a scale that made my mind rebel against processing it. I tried to rationalize it as I walked. I tried to tell myself that Magos Kel was right, that the psychers were sanctioned, that their lives had been forfeit the moment they were discovered and taken by the black ships. I tried to believe that their sacrifice served a greater purpose, that without the Titans, the Imperium would fall, that individual suffering meant nothing compared to the survival of humanity as a species. But I could not make myself believe it. Every argument I constructed collapsed under the weight of what I had seen. Those 6 people had not volunteered. They had not chosen martyrdom. They had been taken, processed, and consumed like any other raw material. And the Titan they now powered would walk across battlefields, would kill in the Emperor's name, would be praised and honored and blessed, and no one would ever know that it was built on screaming. I did not return to the dormitory when I reached the upper levels. Instead, I wandered through the Manufactoria's lesser corridors, moving without purpose, trying to process what I had witnessed. The normal sounds of industrial activity surrounded me. Forge hammers, cutting lasers, the chanting of tech priests performing routine blessings. Everything was normal. Everything continued as it always had. The revelation that had shattered my world had not even caused a ripple in anyone else's. I found myself in one of the memorial gardens, a small plaza where the Mechanicus had erected monuments to particularly renowned tech priests and significant manufacturing achievements, stone columns inscribed with names, bronze plaques commemorating record production outputs, and at the center, a statue of the Omnissiah himself, depicted as a fusion of human and machine, his arms raised in benediction. I stood before that statue and felt nothing. No reverence, no devotion, no sense of connection to the faith I had been raised in. Just emptiness. The Omnissiah, if he existed at all, had abandoned us. Or perhaps he had never been there to begin with. Perhaps we had created him out of desperation, out of our need to believe that our suffering had meaning, that our sacrifices were noticed and valued by something greater than ourselves. Perhaps the machine god was just another machine, created by humans to justify the horrors we inflicted on each other. I did not know. I could not know. But I knew that I could no longer worship without questioning. I could no longer recite the prayers without hearing the screams beneath them. The summons to the Hall of Concordance arrived sooner than expected. I had thought I might have days, perhaps weeks, before facing consequences for my outburst. Instead, the neural message came before I had even left the memorial garden. Report immediately. Do not delay. Non-compliance will result in immediate servitor conversion. The threat was explicit, unambiguous. I was being given one final chance to fall in line, to demonstrate loyalty, to prove that my momentary lapse could be corrected, or I would be lobotomized, my brain scooped out and replaced with basic cogitator programming, my body refitted as a mindless laborer to serve the forges until I broke down entirely. I walked to the Hall of Concordance with the gait of a condemned man approaching his execution. The corridors seemed longer than before. Every worker I passed looked like a potential future version of myself, shambling and vacant-eyed, reduced to flesh automata by the very institution I had once believed would elevate me. The Mechanicus did not tolerate doubt. It had no room for questions. Certainty was demanded, conformity was required, and those who could not or would not comply were simply removed. The Hall of Concordance was exactly as I remembered it from my previous visit, though it felt different now. The painted ceiling, with its depiction of tech priests ascending toward enlightenment, now seemed grotesque. Those figures rising toward the light were not achieving transcendence. They were being absorbed, consumed, transformed into something no longer recognizably human, and below them, the laborers in darkness were not simply performing sacred work, they were fuel. They were the raw material being processed and refined and ultimately burned to power the ascension of others. Magos Kael stood at the chamber's center again, flanked by the same Skitarii and accompanied by the same senior tech priests. But their positions had shifted slightly. The guards were closer now, their weapons no longer at parade rest but held ready. The Magi at the table leaned forward with obvious anticipation. This was not a briefing, this was a trial. Novice Athan Marek. Kael's voice echoed through the chamber. You stand accused of ideological deviation. You have questioned the sacred works of the Omnissiah. You have suggested that the consecration rituals are flawed. You have expressed doubt in the very foundations of the Mechanicus. These are serious charges. How do you answer? I opened my mouth to offer the expected denials, the ritual apologies that might save my life. But the words that emerged were not the ones I had planned. I have no defense, Magos. What I said was true. The psychers suffer. The integration process is not transcendence. It is torture given theological dressing. And I cannot unsee that truth. Silence fell across the chamber. One of the senior Magi actually recoiled slightly, as if I had committed a physical act of violence rather than simply speaking an uncomfortable reality. The Skitarii shifted their stances, weapons rising fractionally. Even Magos Kael seemed momentarily at a loss, his mechanical components whirring audibly as he processed my response. You understand the consequences of this admission. His voice was softer now, almost sorrowful. You are confessing to heresy, to ideological corruption, to rejection of the Omnissiah's wisdom. The prescribed response is either correction through participation in the sacred works or removal via servitor conversion. There is no third option. I understand. My voice was steadier than I expected. I have weighed those options, Magos. Neither is acceptable. I will not participate in further integrations, and I will not allow you to erase my mind to silence my testimony. So I suppose we have reached an impasse. The woman with the bronze death mask leaned forward. You have no bargaining position, novice. You will submit, or you will be taken by force. Your consent is not required. I know, but I wanted you to hear my refusal stated plainly. I wanted it documented, so that somewhere in the Lex Mechanicus archives, there will be a record that at least one person understood what we are doing and rejected it. Even if no one reads that record, even if it changes nothing, it will exist. Magos Kael tilted his head, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his human eye. Not sympathy, exactly, but perhaps a flicker of recognition, of remembering what it felt like to question, before the augmentations and the certainty had burned away all capacity for doubt. Then the moment passed. He gestured to the Skitari. Take him to the preparation chambers. His participation in the next anointment ceremony will begin at dawn. If his faith can be restored through direct communion with the machine spirit, we will make the attempt. If not, he will become part of the unbroken vigil, regardless of his objections. The guards moved with mechanical efficiency. One of them produced a shock maul, its tip crackling with electrical charge. I considered running. I considered fighting, but both options were futile. These were augmented soldiers, bred and modified for violence, following programming that left no room for hesitation or mercy. I would be unconscious or dead within seconds. So I did not resist. I allowed them to bind my hands. I walked between them as they led me from the chamber, and as we passed through the great doors, I looked back one final time at Magos Kael. He was already turning away, returning to his duties, the inconvenience of my doubt already forgotten. The preparation chambers were located in a sub-level I had never visited before, accessed through corridors that grew progressively narrower and more oppressive. The walls here were older than most of the complex, covered in overlapping layers of paint and inscriptions from countless previous uses. Some of the text was in Gothic, some was in machine code, and some was in scripts I did not recognize at all, angular and harsh, suggesting origins that predated even the Imperium's founding. The chamber itself was exactly what I had feared, a surgical theater, a conversion facility, a place where bodies were taken apart and rebuilt according to the needs of the Mechanicus. The walls were lined with medical servitors and automated surgical units, their instruments gleaming under harsh white lumens. In the center of the room was the table. Metal, cold, fitted with magnetic restraints at regular intervals. And beside it, on a wheeled cart, was an array of neural interface equipment. Drills, plugs, cables, all the tools necessary to connect a human consciousness to a machine, whether that human consented or not. They strapped me down, they secured my head in a vise that prevented any movement, and then they left me there, alone except for the servitors and the automated systems, to contemplate what was coming. I had hours to think, hours to lie on that table, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold metal against my back, knowing that when dawn came I would be taken to the integration chamber and wired into the unbroken vigil. I would become one of the components I had witnessed. My consciousness would be fragmented and fed into the Titan's neural core. I would spend whatever remained of my existence trapped inside a war machine, experiencing every battle, every death it caused, unable to escape or find peace, or even fully comprehend what I had become. The worst part was knowing that it would work. The Mechanicus had perfected this process over millennia. They knew exactly how much consciousness to preserve, how much to destroy, how to create the perfect balance between human intuition and mechanical efficiency. I would not die. I would simply cease to be Athan Marek and become instead a fragment of something larger, a neuron in a distributed brain, a voice in a chorus of screaming, and I could not stop it. I tried to pray. Not to the Omnissiah, but to something else. To the Emperor, perhaps, though I had never been particularly devout in his worship. to whatever force might govern the universe, if any such force existed. I prayed for deliverance, for intervention, for some miraculous reprieve that would spare me from this fate, but the ceiling offered no response. The servitors continued their slow patrol around the chamber's perimeter. The automated systems cycled through their maintenance routines. The universe was indifferent to my suffering, just as it had been indifferent to the Psychers, just as it would be indifferent to everyone who came after me. I was alone. I had always been alone. The Mechanicus did not care about its members. It cared about its machines. And I was simply another component waiting to be installed. The first explosion came just before dawn. It was distant, muffled by layers of rockcrete and steel, but powerful enough to make the preparation chamber shake. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lumens flickered. The servitors paused in their routines, their simple programming confused by the unexpected disruption. For a moment, everything was still. Then came a second explosion, closer this time, and a third, and alarms began to wail throughout the entire complex. I strained against the restraints, trying to see what was happening, but the vice holding my head prevented me from turning. I could only stare at the ceiling and listen as chaos erupted somewhere above. There were sounds of weapons fire now, the distinctive crack of las rifles, the deeper boom of bolters, and voices shouting in languages I could not identify, calling out coordinates and tactical assessments. Someone was attacking the manufactoria. The preparation chamber's door burst open. Not slowly, not carefully. It simply exploded inward, blown off its hinges by a shaped demolition charge. Through the smoke and debris stepped figures in armor I did not immediately recognize. They were not skittery. They were not tech priests. They wore carapace plating in colors that had been scorched and stained by years of combat. Their weapons were a mix of Imperial and Xenos technology, cobbled together from salvage and field repairs, and their faces, visible through cracked rebreathers and damaged helmets, showed the hard-eyed pragmatism of people who had long since stopped caring about regulations or doctrine. They were scavengers, raiders, the kind of outlaws who haunted the edges of Imperial space, preying on isolated facilities and poorly defended targets. The kind of people I had been taught to fear and despise. One of them approached my table, her armor marked with the symbol of some warband I did not recognize. She looked down at me with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. Well, this is not what I expected to find in a prep chamber. You, Mechanicus or prisoner. I could not speak. I could only stare at her, my mind struggling to process this sudden reversal. The raiders were not here to rescue me. They were here to loot. They had breached the manufactoria looking for salvage, for valuable tech they could steal and sell on the black markets that flourished in the void between stars. I was simply an inconvenient complication in their raid. The woman studied me for a moment longer, then made a decision. She pulled a plasma cutter from her belt and began severing the magnetic restraints. The metal parted with a smell of scorched ozone, and suddenly I could move again. I sat up slowly, my body aching from hours of immobility, my wrists marked with deep bruises where the restraints had dug in. "You were about to be converted," she said. It was not a question. I have seen these prep chambers before. On other Forge worlds, they turn people into servitors, or worse, she gestured toward the neural interface equipment. "You piss off someone important?" I spoke the truth. My voice was hoarse. I questioned their methods. I doubted the Omnissiah. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Then you are smarter than most. Come on, we are pulling out in 5 minutes. If you want to live, you follow us. If you want to stay and let them finish what they started, that is your choice. But choose quickly." I did not hesitate. I rolled off the table, my legs nearly giving out beneath me, and stumbled after the raiders as they withdrew from the chamber. Behind us, the automated systems continued their routines, oblivious to the fact that their subject had escaped. The servitors turned slowly, tracking our movement with their optical sensors, but they had not been programmed to respond to this situation. They simply watched as we fled. The corridors outside were absolute chaos. Fires burned in several sections. Bulkheads had collapsed, blocking passages and forcing detours. Bodies lay scattered where Skitarii and raiders had clashed, the dead from both sides left where they fell. The raiders moved with practiced efficiency, following routes they had clearly scouted in advance, taking turns that avoided the heaviest fighting. I followed numbly, my mind still reeling from the speed of events. We passed through sections I recognized, manufactorum floors I had supervised, assembly lines I had documented. Everything was in ruins now. The raiders had blown open armories, stealing weapons and ammunition. They had accessed data vaults, corrupting or copying information that would fetch high prices from the right buyers, and everywhere they went, they left destruction in their wake. Not out of malice, necessarily, just the inevitable result of their presence, like a storm tearing through a settlement. Eventually we reached an exterior loading bay, where the raiders had docked their transport ship. It was a battered cargo hauler, scarred by weapons impacts and jury-rigged repairs, its hull marked with kill tallies and devotional graffiti from a dozen different faiths. The boarding ramp was down, and other raiders were already loading their salvage, moving with the urgency of people who knew their window was closing. The woman who had freed me grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the ramp. "When we get clear, you will tell me everything about this facility. Defenses, weak points, manufacturing schedules, everything. That is the price of your rescue. You will help us plan better raids. You will become what you Mechanicus types call a traitor." I could have refused. I could have fought. I could have chosen to die there rather than betray the institution that had raised me. But as I looked back at the Manufactoria, at the burning towers and the collapsing structures, I realized I had already betrayed everything I once believed in. I had questioned the Omnissiah. I had rejected the sacred works. I had chosen my own conscience over the demands of the Mechanicus. I was already a traitor. I had been one from the moment I allowed myself to see the Psychers as people rather than components. So I nodded. "I will help you. Whatever you need to know." She smiled, a expression without warmth. "Good. Welcome to the other side, Mechanicus. Try not to get yourself killed before you become useful." The transport lifted off minutes later, its engines straining under the weight of stolen goods and evacuating personnel. Through the viewport, I watched Riser fall away beneath us. I watched the Manufactoria continue to burn. I watched Skitari squads converging on the breach points, too late to stop the raid, arriving only in time to count the cost. And somewhere in those burning structures, the unbroken vigil waited, still incomplete, still wired with the minds of 6 tortured Psychers, still destined to walk and kill and be praised as holy. I thought about those Psychers often in the days and weeks that followed. I wondered if they were aware of what had happened, if some fragment of their consciousness registered the chaos and the destruction and hoped briefly that it might lead to their freedom. But I knew the truth. They would not be freed. The Mechanicus would repair the damage. They would complete the Titan's construction. They would activate it and send it to war, and those 6 people would remain trapped inside, experiencing every moment of the machine's existence, screaming silently for a mercy that would never come. The raiders were not kind. They were not gentle. They were survivors in a galaxy that offered no rewards for compassion. They kept me alive because I had value, because my knowledge of Mechanicus facilities could help them plan more profitable raids. They put me to work almost immediately, having me analyze schematics and security protocols, identifying weaknesses in Forge World defenses that they could exploit. I helped them. I provided detailed information about Riser's layout, about other Manufactoria I knew of, about the patterns and procedures that governed Mechanicus operations. Every piece of data I shared resulted in more raids, more deaths, more destruction, and I told myself it was justified, that the Mechanicus deserved to be hurt, to be weakened, to have their secrets exposed and their sanctuaries violated, that they had forfeited any moral authority when they chose to build their empire on suffering and call it holy. But late at night, when I lay in my bunk on the transport ship, listening to the hum of the engines and the snoring of the other raiders, I wondered if I was any better than the people I had betrayed. The Mechanicus justified their atrocities by claiming they served a greater purpose, that individual suffering meant nothing compared to the survival of humanity. And now I was doing the same thing. I was helping raiders steal and kill and destroy, telling myself it was acceptable because it hurt an institution I had come to hate. The logic was identical. Only the scale had changed. Years passed. I drifted from one outlaw band to another, selling my expertise to anyone willing to pay or offer protection. I saw dozens of forge worlds, hive cities, mining colonies. I witnessed the Imperium from angles I had never known existed during my time with the Mechanicus. I saw the casual cruelty of administratum bureaucrats who calculated lives in ledgers and deemed entire populations expendable for marginal increases in efficiency. I saw the brutal enforcement of the Arbites, who maintained order through overwhelming violence and called it justice. I saw the corruption of planetary governors who lived in obscene luxury while their subjects starved in the underhives below. And I saw Titans. Everywhere I went, sooner or later, I saw Titans, walking battlefields, crushing rebellions, defending hive cities from Xeno's incursions. They were magnificent and terrible, exactly as I had been taught they would be. Crowds cheered when they appeared. Soldiers took courage from their presence. Poets wrote verses celebrating their glory. No one knew. No one understood. They looked at those towering war machines and saw the Emperor's protection, the Omnissiah's blessing, the physical manifestation of humanity's determination to survive against impossible odds. They did not see the psychers wired into the neural cores. They did not see the families flayed to anchor the machine spirits. They did not see the thousands of workers who died during construction, crushed or burned or worked to death, their bodies recycled as raw materials for the next project. They saw gods. I saw prisons. I tried to tell people. In bars and trading posts, in refugee camps and mercenary halls, I would share what I had witnessed. I would explain how Titans were truly made. I would describe the integration chambers and the restraint frames and the screaming that never ended. And people would listen, politely or otherwise, and then they would dismiss me as a madman, or a heretic, or someone suffering from trauma-induced delusions, because the truth was too horrifying to accept. Because if the Titans were built on suffering, if the Mechanicus's greatest achievements were monuments to cruelty, then what did that say about the Imperium as a whole? What did it say about the faith that billions of people used to give meaning to their otherwise brutal lives? It was easier to dismiss one raving ex-novice than to question the foundations of their entire worldview. So I stopped trying to convince anyone. I simply survived. I took jobs that paid. I avoided imperial authorities. I moved from system to system, never staying long enough to attract attention, never forming connections that might make me vulnerable. I became exactly what the Mechanicus had always warned against: a wanderer without purpose, a life without direction, flesh that served no function beyond its own continuation. But I remembered. Every day, I remembered. I remembered the faces of those 6 psychers. I remembered the woman who had looked at me and mouthed, "Why?" I remembered the sound of the unbroken vigil's first scream. And I carried that memory like a wound that would not heal, a burden I could not set down even if I wanted to. Because someone had to remember. Someone had to bear witness, even if it changed nothing. Even if the Titans continued to walk, and the Mechanicus continued to build them, and the Imperium continued to praise them as holy, someone had to know the truth. Someone had to acknowledge the cost. I am that someone. I am the last person standing who saw what I saw and understood what it meant. The raiders who freed me are long dead now, killed in various raids or betrayals, or simply worn down by the brutality of outlaw life. The tech priests who presided over that integration are probably still serving on Riser, conducting the same rituals, speaking the same prayers, never questioning whether their devotion to the Omnissiah justifies the suffering they inflict. And the unbroken vigil walks. I have tracked its deployments over the years, through intercepted military dispatches and traders' gossip. It fought at the siege of Calistris Prime, where it single-handedly broke an Orc War and saved an entire sector from greenskin conquest. It defended Hive Talus from a Tyranid splinter fleet, standing for 3 days against endless waves of Xeno's abominations until reinforcements could arrive. It participated in the Calixis Crusade, crushing heretic forces and reclaiming lost worlds for the Imperium. It is a hero. It is celebrated. It is blessed. And inside its metal shell, 6 people continue to scream. I do not know if they are still conscious after all these years. I do not know if the integration eventually destroys enough of their individuality that they achieve some form of peace, or if they remain aware, trapped and suffering, experiencing every moment of the Titan's existence without hope of escape or relief. The Mechanicus does not publish studies on the long-term psychological state of integrated psychers. Such information is considered sacred mystery, not to be shared with the uninitiated. But I suspect the suffering never ends, because if it did, if the process eventually granted some form of release, then the tech priests would not need to keep the psychers' bodies alive. They would not need to maintain the life support systems wired into those restraint frames. They could simply harvest the neural patterns and discard the flesh. The fact that they keep the bodies functioning suggests that consciousness must remain anchored to biology, that the link between mind and meat cannot be severed without destroying the delicate balance required for the machine spirit to function, which means those 6 people are still in there, still suffering, still trapped, and they will remain that way until the unbroken vigil is destroyed in battle or decommissioned due to irreparable damage. Only then will death finally claim them. Only then will they find the peace that should have been granted decades ago. I am old now. My body has begun to fail in the ways bodies do when neglected and abused for too long. I have no augmentations to sustain me, no mechanical replacements to extend my function beyond natural limits. I will die soon, probably within the next few years, and when I do, the memories I carry will die with me. No one else saw what I saw. No one else knows what I know. The truth will be lost, unless I record it, unless I leave some testimony, some account that might survive beyond my death. So I am writing this, all of it. Every detail I can recall from that day in the integration chamber, from my training and my faith and my terrible awakening to the reality beneath the Mechanicus's promises. I am writing it and encrypting it and hiding it in data caches scattered across a dozen different systems, hoping that someday someone might find it, someone might read it, someone might understand. I have no illusions that this testimony will change anything. The Imperium is too vast, too old, too dependent on its atrocities to survive even one more day of existence. The Titans will continue to be built. The Psychers will continue to be harvested. The tech priests will continue to sing their hymns and perform their rituals and convince themselves that they serve the machine god rather than simply perpetuating an endless cycle of sanctified cruelty. But perhaps, somewhere in the far future, when the Imperium has finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, when the last Forge world has gone dark and the last Titan has fallen silent, someone will find these records. They will read about Athan Marek, a novice who saw too much and paid for his knowledge with everything he once believed. They will learn what the Titans truly were, and perhaps they will understand that humanity's greatest weapons were also its greatest sins. That is my hope, my only hope, that someday the truth will matter more than convenience, that someday suffering will be acknowledged rather than buried beneath devotional cant, that someday the people who were sacrificed to create these god machines will be remembered as people rather than dismissed as components. Until then, I carry their memory. I speak their names, the names I gave them because no one else thought they deserved names. I say them aloud when I am alone, in the darkness before sleep claims me. And I tell them I am sorry. Sorry that I did not do more. Sorry that I could not save them. Sorry that I stood and watched while they were destroyed and did nothing except document their suffering in data streams and call it holy work. I failed them. I failed everyone who came before them and everyone who has come after. I am complicit in their torture by virtue of my inaction, my silence, my cowardice, and no amount of testimony, no volume of written confession can absolve me of that guilt. But I can remember. I can bear witness. I can ensure that their suffering is not forgotten, even if it cannot be avenged or prevented or given meaning. That is all I have left. That is all I am. A memory, a warning, a voice crying out in the darkness of the 41st millennium, knowing that no one is listening, knowing that nothing will change, but crying out anyway because the alternative is to accept that their pain meant nothing. And I cannot accept that. I will not accept that. Their pain must mean something. It must matter, even if only to me, even if only for the few years I have left before death claims me and silence falls. So I write, I remember, I testify, and I pray to whatever gods might exist beyond the lies of the Imperium, that someday someone will read these words and understand. That someday the truth will be more important than the comfortable fictions that allow us to sleep at night while atrocities are committed in our names. That someday we will look at our titans and see them for what they truly are, not gods, not saviors, not holy instruments of the Omnissiah's will, but monuments to our willingness to inflict infinite suffering in pursuit of victory, cathedrals of pain, prisons of adamantium and flesh, walking testaments to humanity's capacity for cruelty when we convince ourselves that the ends justify the means. I have lived my entire life in the shadow of gods, and now I die knowing that those gods were demons all along, that we created them, that we fed them with the lives of those we deemed expendable, that we praised them even as they screamed. The Mechanicus calls this enlightenment. The Imperium calls it necessity. History will call it by its true name, atrocity.